Well, it's my happy duty to introduce and moderate the second panel. Let me just begin by introducing myself briefly. I'm Bill Galston, a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program here at Brookings. Delighted to be a small cog in the Brookings Service Year Alliance machine that has produced this meeting. I want to thank two people in particular, Belle Sawhill for conceiving of this day and working tirelessly over a period of at least 6 months to bring it about. And also our president, John Allen, for lending his vast experience and immense moral authority to our enterprise this morning. And I think it's a sign that Brookings is spiritually aligned with the national service movement. Let me introduce the question this way. If national service is the answer, what's the question? And we have heard, and I think will hear, three very different kinds of answers to that question, and it's useful to keep them separate. The first has to do with service as an avenue of personal growth, the expansion and the deepening of character. The second has to do with actual good done for others, service in the root sense. But the third, and this is where the paper by John Bridgeland and John DiIulio begins, is with our broader civic challenges and with national service as a potential response to those challenges. What are those challenges? Well, first of all, a decline of mutual trust among fellow citizens, sorts of things that the survey researchers call general social trust. Second is a precipitous rise in divisive partisanship. There's a difference between a party system and partisanship. And sometime in the past 2 generations, we have crossed that line and now find ourselves in a very uncomfortable and unproductive place. And third is what I would call the erosion of the problem-solving mentality. The idea that elected and appointed officials are engaged in a common civic enterprise where the problems that the public has identified call out for responses, solutions that the public itself cannot specify. And the job of public service is to turn public ends into public means. I've personally been deeply impressed with the quality of the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who have entered public service. They have this problem-solving mentality in spades, and one of the questions is whether the national service experience on the civilian side can replicate that kind of we're all in it together in the same foxhole now, how do we find a way to prevail? Will that mentality spread? Or to put it in very old-fashioned language that goes all the way back to William James, is national service the moral equivalent of war? Or is there no moral equivalent of war? Well, we have a fantastic panel to help us address these questions. I'll begin to my immediate left with John Bridgeland, who is the former director of the White House Policy Council under President George W. Bush and currently serves as the vice chair of the Service Year Alliance, about which you've already heard and from whom you've already heard. His partner in crime, John DiIulio Jr., who is the professor of politics, religion, and civil society, which sort of means you're a professor of everything at the University of Pennsylvania. And John also has White House experience as the first director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives in 2001, which means that Bridge and John were colleagues, perhaps a little bit more briefly than might have been expected, but yes, they were. To their left is Tay Adams, who is the Director of Government Relations for the Service Year Alliance, which means she is where the service year hits the political road. That is a very important nexus that she's going to help us explore. And finally, Pete Waner, who is currently a vice president and senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He also has very substantial White House experience as a speechwriter, as the director of strategy, and also, I would say, as a moral voice. Right? Very few have reflected more deeply than Pete on what it means to have a healthy society and what our current ills are and to what they can be traced. And he will offer some reflections from a distinctively conservative and I would add faith-based perspective on national service. So without further ado, John Bridgeland and John DiIulio are going jointly to present their paper, Will America Embrace National Service? Let me just add one note. I think there's a broad commitment to shared ideals and goals in the room, but we can't get carried away with ourselves, right? This is Brookings, so empirical inquiry matters a lot because it's where we test the feasibility of the ideas that we cherish and may have to change those ideas in some respects as the result of what honest inquiry discovers. And this paper, if I may say so, is a model of honest inquiry, and it does its co-authors proud, and Brookings is proud to be associated with it. John Bridgeland,
Bill Galston. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see a packed house. We need packed houses for national service all across America. I want to thank Bill Galston, without whom, actually, AmeriCorps, together with Susan Stroud, who I see in the back, Alan Casey, a lot of people, Bell, in the audience, actually wouldn't have come into existence in a time in the life in the country when President Clinton said, you invest in your country, we'll invest in you. And it was a galvanizing moment. I also want to thank Belle Sawhill. She launched the Social Genome Project and a whole host of initiatives. And it seems like anything Belle gets behind actually happens. So I'm more optimistic about national service now that you're conducting this panel. I also want to thank John DiIulio and Pete Waner. I had 15 years in public service, greatest years of my life, and having the opportunity to serve side by side with John and Pete after 9/11. And seeing this emergence from the country of people all over the globe wanting to make common cause to make a better country and world together was really quite extraordinary. When I came in this morning, I met General, Congressman, and Dr. Joseph Heck. And I said, is that all? And he goes, no, actually, I founded the Medical Reserve Corps after 9/11. So that's the model of what we're trying to achieve in America, people who view national service, citizen service as fundamental and foundational. I wasn't going to go into, but now that Joe said that the commission is going to focus on civic education, it just reminds me that the people who founded our country, George Washington said, when we assumed the soldier, we did not lay down the citizen. John Adams said, our duty to serve our country ends but with our lives. When Jefferson penned this mystical notion of the pursuit of happiness, it wasn't just an individual right, but as Governor Deval Patrick reminded us, it was actually a cooperative, a collective enterprise that we help one another achieve. And I can't be truly happy if I'm not worrying about the happiness of my neighbor and someone who's homeless or vulnerable or worried. And it was that spirit, we the people, that really was the foundation of our democracy and the foundation of this country. And I think we have to rescue that spirit. So why now? Why always for national service? What's the problem we're trying to address? The first panel spoke so eloquently about our civic collapse. But I want to share a story. I grew up on Drake Road in Cincinnati, Ohio, just a few doors down from a man named Neil Armstrong. And this very shy, reclusive man used to come over for dinner. And when I was at a very impressionable age, he said, you know, the audacity of this young president to go to the well of the house and summon the nation to put a man on the moon within a decade and return him safely, within 10 years. And we actually had no idea how to pull it off. And yet 400,000 engineers around the country worked together to make it happen. And I remember being a 9-year-old kid on the screen porch watching Neil Armstrong land on the moon. And it seems to me that, as Governor Patrick and others mentioned, we have so many challenges in this country that national service can actually help address. I don't see why we don't have opportunity millennium goals in the country to take on education and conservation and poverty and a whole host of issues that national service, there's evidence that national service could help address. It's also interesting to note, what's the problem we're trying to address? Robert Putnam wrote 2 wonderful books, Bowling Alone, Better Together, actually a third called Our Kids. And when I asked him for an historic perspective, he said, that social cohesion or social fragmentation, political polarization, economic inequality, and civic collapse all actually work in virtual lockstep. And if you look at trends from the Gilded Age through the 1960s and 70s and even today, you see them moving together. And so what we do as a nation civically, how we take care of our communities, as Deval was talking about so eloquently, matters significantly to how we view one another, how we view inequality economically. And of course, I think we're having a political, cultural, and economic nervous breakdown in this country. So we see the effects of a lack of understanding of the Constitution. Mortimer Adler wrote this wonderful book called We Hold These Truths on the 200th anniversary of the celebration of the Declaration that said the highest office in the United States is not the presidency, it's citizen. And we need to remind young people all over this country that big citizenship is really the wave of the future. I want to talk concretely, though, because I know, I can't tell you the number of audiences we speak to all over the country. And Stan McChrystal, who's our chair, comes back from speaking and, rallying the chorus of union. But there's always this wonder, could we actually pull it off? Why, for such a big idea that, as Jesse Colvin, our CEO, has mentioned, attracts widespread public support among Republicans, Democrats, independents? We talk about the civic healing effects. I've co-chaired something called the Earth Conservation Corps for over a decade with Ethel Kennedy and Bob Nixon. And we work with the most vulnerable kids in the Anacostia, Congress Heights, Kenilworth. And interestingly, one day, they were serving on the Anacostia, and we had brought kids from McLean and Potomac and had this great mixing in our service efforts. And I sort of had the audacity to ask, what politics are you? And there were Republicans, there were Democrats, there was even a libertarian. What faiths are you? There were Christians, Jews, Muslims. And the project that they were working on was actually bringing the bald eagle, our nation's symbol, back to the nation's capital. And we have bald eagles who fly over this beautiful landscape day in and day out because of the work of those national service participants. But I want to talk just briefly about, could we bring this idea to scale, and what have we learned from various models? Interestingly, in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt calls Congress into emergency session, and by summer has 250,000 young unemployed men in the woods through the Civilian Conservation Corps. By the end of the program, 3 million had served, 3 billion trees had been planted, 84 million acres of land had been saved, which is the entire acreage of our national park system today. And when you talk to the CCC boys, it was a spiritual experience for them. It changed the trajectory of the rest of their lives. It was also run by the U.S. Army, and a young George C. Marshall organized the CCC camps. So the thought that we would have, for the first time since 1933, a commission looking how we marry military, civilian, and national service opportunities together is really compelling. Second, the Peace Corps, the thought that we'd have U.S. policy to send our sons and daughters, our mothers and fathers, eventually our grandmothers grandmothers and grandfathers to remote areas all across the world to meet needs in other countries was sort of a bold experiment. But when Shriver sent his memo to John Kennedy in 1961, he actually didn't want to just create a federal program called Peace Corps. He wanted to run Peace Corps through nonprofit organizations, colleges and universities, agencies at all levels. And Peace Corps remains small today because that vision wasn't fulfilled. And then came AmeriCorps roaring along, which actually had that instinct to go to the strength of America, to its nonprofit institutions and colleges and universities, and to give support to those institutions and build off the strength of civil society. And so I think those models are really instructive as we think about how do we marry military, civilian, and public service, and how do we go to where the strength of the country is today, which is in its institutions of civil society. So over to Brother D, talk about other elements of our report, including mandatory versus civilian national service.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bridge. And I know some of you are wondering what these socks are. And they are Philadelphia Eagles socks. So go Birds. I feel your pain, Redskins fans. I really do.
Go Nats.
Go
we
Nats.
Feel everybody else's pain.
Well, I'm not going to say anything. No comment. But I want to thank the wonderful Bell Sawhill for inviting me to participate in this. And it's a special treat and honor to be here with three dear old friends, the amazing Bill Galston, the inspiring John Bridgeland, and the brilliant and the bold Pete Waner. And Tay, you're the only one up here who's practicing what everybody's preaching for real. So it's a special treat and honor to meet you and be with you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little time. I will, as they say in Congress, yield the balance of my time back to Brother Bridgeland and just talk a little bit about two aspects of this Will America Embrace National Service Report. The part that deals with public opinion and the part that deals with evidence on the benefits of national service. So, if you go back and you look at the polling data on national service all the way back to the creation of AmeriCorps from 1993 to the present, so I'm looking at all the surveys that have been done, I think it's fair to say that there is one overarching conclusion, there are two corollary findings, and there's one caution. I'm going to be very brief in expressing these. The overarching conclusion is that, indeed, most Americans do support national service. That's every demographic description, that's every socioeconomic status, it's without regard to partisan identification or ideological disposition. They favor national service if it is voluntary. That is, unpaid, not required by law, or both. And majorities tend to oppose it if it is mandatory or compulsory, defined as in required by law or enforced, administered by the government. One corollary finding is that the in-favor majorities shrink if voluntary is government supported. If you say expressly, oh, by the way, government's got a nickel in the quarter or 25 cents in the dollar, it shrinks a bit. And if it is mandatory or compulsory, again, it goes down even more. But there's no question that the overall finding still is that Americans of every demographic description favor national service. Another corollary finding is that most people believe that service, and that's whether the service is national or community, paid or unpaid, benefits the servers. People believe that it develops skills, it enhances civic responsibility. They believe it benefits the persons, organizations, and communities where people serve by supplying direct services or performing vital work in the community. And they believe it benefits the wider society. That is, that it elevates citizenship, helps to model civic responsibility, helps to bridge, which we've heard a lot about this morning, socioeconomic, political, and other divides. So that's what the folks believe. But there is one caution here. And the caution is that for all the polls that have been done, the fact is we still have a relatively limited universe of polls, and they're not all entirely well-constructed and well-conducted. There are all kinds of stratification and sampling issues and interpretation issues and so forth. In fact, even if you compare the polling, the research, the survey research on national service to polling data and survey research on other not top line issues like faith-based initiatives and so forth, it is a relatively anemic survey research literature. So what's needed there is a tune-up. And if you're interested in that, you look at the appendix to our report, you'll find that we have some suggestions about how you could go about at a relatively inexpensive, because good polls are expensive and doing them right is expensive, how you might be able to improve the research, survey research on national service. Let me now turn quickly to the benefits of national service. We know, I mean, we could probably fill this very nice room here at Brookings with all the studies that have been done with looking at the empirically looking at the benefits of national service. And the vast majority of those suggest that national service works. But we need to make a couple of distinctions here. We know that volunteering works. We know that compared to otherwise comparable people who volunteer, right? People who do the volunteering have higher life satisfaction, higher self-esteem, better self-rated health, better occupational and academic outcomes, longer lives. I'm getting to elder myself these days. Longer lives, and lots of other positive outcomes. But we need to remember that the evidence on the benefits of volunteering is not, of course, synonymous with the evidence on the benefits of volunteer programs per se, or of national service programs in particular. And so whether with respect to helping out at one's church or neighborhood school or community elder care facility or in other ways, much of what counts and gets counted as volunteering occurs wholly outside the context of any regular commitments and any quasi-formal or formal programmatic organizational setting or context, right? We have to just make that distinction. Now, that duly remembered, that duly said, the fact is that when you do look at the research literature that does address national service programs in particular, the findings are very positive. There was a landmark literature review done in 2004. Nothing has quite been done at that level of sophistication since. That looked at 139 pretty good studies. And the bottom line conclusion of that literature review on national service programs was that in the vast majority of cases, you have national service program outcomes exceeding null or negative effects by a lot, like 6 and 7 to 1. And that's a lot. I mean, it's gargantuan, actually. And many of the benefits in most of the studies, I guess if you were to say what benefits are most well documented, it really would be the server's skill development, the benefits, direct benefits to beneficiaries of the programs, service expansion, and harder to measure improvements in service quality. It's all there. So we also have made a promising start, I would say, with respect to benefit cost analyses of national service programs. There was a wonderful study done in 2013 by Clive Belfield, a study that was done for, I guess it was for the Franklin Project and Civic Enterprises and Voices for National Service, which found a benefit cost ratio of federal national service programs, AmeriCorps in particular, of about 4 to 1. And that's also a gargantuan finding. But our benefit cost analyses still, too, are surprisingly in their infancy. I hate to mouth and conclude with the cliche that more research is needed, but more research is needed. And I think that but that all said, I want to just conclude before I turn it back to Bridge. I want to conclude by saying that I wouldn't be afraid in this particular area to go with the plural of anecdote is data. And let me just tell you why. This is not in our report, but I've been, in fact, I met one of my former Princeton students here who works at the Brookings Institution a moment ago, back to 1999. I've been in the academic dodge so I haven't had a real job, for almost 40 years. And I could tell you that in all those years, the last 15, 20 years at the University of Penn, running a academic leadership and service learning program, hundreds and hundreds of former students, I get letters and cards and emails all the time, and they say, boy, Prof. D, the best thing that we ever did was all those service programs like participating in the human, physical, and financial recovery process in post-Katrina New Orleans over 10 years. It was transformational. It's a laboratory for learning. So, I believe it. I think we're close. I don't say we've proven it, but we're getting closer, and a little bit more research. But I'm not afraid of those data that are based on those anecdotes. So, Bridge, you can go from there.
Very good. Way to go. He was going to go into construction with cousin Jimmy and turned out to be a professor, and we're so glad.
What are you going to do?
So I'm going to
Cousin Genevieve is pretty happy about it.
Yeah, I think so. Very, very quickly in the paper, Will America Embrace National Service, which really is an open question. We sort of throw down the gauntlet. We actually outline a plan of action that we also submitted with General McChrystal, Secretary Gates, Secretary Rice, and others to the National Commission that Joe is leading. And after 9/11, we actually talked about mandatory national service. And our White House counsel came down to the office and said, well, it probably violates the 13th Amendment prohibition on involuntary servitude, probably violates the Fifth Amendment deprivation of liberty, and may violate, depending on the circumstance, the First Amendment on religious free exercise and free speech. We did a 2-year study of mandatory national service in the United States. A lot of people are sympathetic to it and found that there is a zone of constitutionality. You could actually structure a mandatory national service program that would satisfy the constitutional requirements, but there is almost zero political support for it. Charlie Rangel introduces the lonely bill in the U.S. Congress every year, and a few people join onto it, and nothing ever happens. So politically, it's not feasible. But what we think is feasible is something approaching mandatory national service, which is large-scale, universal, voluntary national service. I want to just quickly outline what we propose in the Service Year Alliance and sent to the Commission in terms of its core elements. The first, we've done it before, is to actually set a national goal of 250,000 full-time civilian national service opportunities for 18 to 28-year-olds. That's actually the exact number that the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act, that Orrin Hatch, conservative Republican Orrin Hatch, who was the first person to call me after 9/11, said, I'm a Mormon. I did my Mormon mission in the Great Lakes when I was a young man. It ignited my 34 years of service in the U.S. Senate. It can change the trajectory of young people in this country. And so we know we can get there historically. We're only at about 66,000 full-time service opportunities today. Second, we can link military and civilian national service together. So it might surprise you, 75% of the people who apply for the military are disqualified because they're high school dropouts, bad behavior, some are in prison, or they're in poor health. 75%. Why couldn't the U.S. Selective Service System be a conveyor belt for civilian national service? And so when I got my notice at 18, in addition to learning about the 5 branches of the military, why didn't I learn about City Year and Habitat and Teach for America and all these other wonderful opportunities? In turn, the military tells us that there are communities where the communities aren't interested in military recruiting, and having civilian national service opportunities as part of that system may even help military recruitment. Third, linking national service to college access. Jesse Colvin mentioned all these presidential candidates are coming forward with plans. Why isn't that if you invest in your country invests in you? Why don't you get a full year of college in the state you're from or attending for every year you do of national or other service, just like the GI Bill? Fourth, recognizing national service as a civic apprenticeship, that when you finish your year or more of national service, you actually get a credential that's relevant to getting a job, and that employers see all the skills, leadership, collaborative problem solving, all the social and emotional skills that many employers think are missing in our workforce. Finally, I think a very big idea is actually to democratize and open up national service by creating service year fellowships. They could be called AmeriCorps service year fellowships, but basically giving it to the individual. That individual can make a choice about what accredited national service organization they want to serve in. And instead of having just large grants going to a few nonprofit organizations in the country, you would open up and really fulfill Sergeant Shriver's vision, which is colleges and universities, nonprofit organizations, institutions of civil society. You'd have this diaspora, this growing community of institutions and young people with choice who would really be accelerating and advancing the national service idea. So that's it from us. We worked hard on this paper. Please read it. It'll make us feel better. And back to you.
Thanks, John and John. Well, you've just heard from the best of academic research on national service. Now for some reality therapy. Tay, how does this translate into actual legislation, and how is that working for you?
Thank you. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
The trick is to hold it really close.
Okay, and remind me if I let the mic slide a little bit, but it's a thrill to be here and a great pleasure to be on the panel. Thank you, Belle. Thank you, Brookings, and thank you for this great paper. And before I actually talk about what this looks like on the Hill and the policy proposals that Service Year Alliance is moving forward, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and my connection to service. So I do lead the government relations work at Service Year Alliance, and unlike a lot of the panelists, I didn't complete a service year, didn't serve in the military, didn't serve in office, excuse me. So my connection to service in a real way really started about 10 years ago when I was working in Philadelphia. I had just transitioned from a career practicing law into something that was a bit more meaningful to me, and for me that was public education. And one of my coworkers at the time was doing a similar career transition, but for her, she was transitioning from teaching, from the New Teachers Project, which is an AmeriCorps program, into the policy side. And so it was really the deep commitment that I saw from her to the students that even though she wasn't teaching anymore, she was still very much involved in their lives. We'd walk down the street and people would run down and say, Mrs. Gardner, Mrs. Gardner. She was invited to their graduations, proms, unfortunately sometimes their funerals. But it was that deep connection that I saw at that point that really introduced me to service. And through my career in Philadelphia and then in DC, the exposure to AmeriCorps programs, TNTP, City Year, Urban Teachers, it really kind of developed my commitment. And what was interesting to me also is you have this idea of who serves and who is serving whom. And what I noticed is you had people coming from within their communities to serve in their community, outside of the community from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic. And so that's really where I got inspired, as Bridge said, to almost join the revolution. And so when I had the opportunity to join Service Year Alliance, I jumped at the chance to join an organization that wanted to bring service at scale for young people and make sure that it's a common opportunity. And so what I wanted to talk about today is actually what does this look like? Like, how do we make this happen? And we know that the federal piece is going to be a large piece. And so I wanted to elaborate on the piece of federal legislation that we are trying to move forward as part of our Serve America Together campaign. We do call for universal national service, but I did want to make sure that I clarify once again that we don't advocate for mandatory. By universal, we mean a common expectation and opportunity for all young people to serve. And so what we've done is we've drafted a bill that we think fills the gaps that we see on the federal level. And we also think that it's a bit strategic. We know this is a bipartisan issue, but we wanted to draft something that we could really create a true bipartisan bill. And so we're calling it right now the National Service Choice Act. And it does 4 things, which I'll talk about, and then kind of lay out what that actually looks like in reality. So first and foremost, what we think is key is that it focuses on local communities. This is from the bottom up, what we're hearing from communities, how they view national service, meeting needs in their community. It also connects military and civilian, which is very important on the federal level, and then provides a flexibility of fellowships, which right now are named in the honor of the late Senator John McCain. So these would be McCain Fellows that would be issued to states that develop these service plans. And then very important, it makes sure that everyone can serve and then also brings together young people in the community who are serving to form those relationships. I know the word relationships came up a little bit earlier, and so bringing people together in a real way. So what does this look like? What we're proposing is a new Interagency Council that would be managed between CNCS and DoD, the Department of Defense, really making that connection on the federal level between civilian and national service. As Bridge had mentioned earlier, a lot of people that are interested in serving in the military are not qualified, and why shouldn't they then be directed to national service opportunities? And we also foresee a world where the Department of Defense could also do some type of joint promotion with national service programs. So we have that connection on the top level. And then we have states that want to raise their hand and say, we see service as a strategy to meeting our community needs. And so what this would do is the Interagency Council would review these local plans developed by states, talking about how service would be a strategy to meeting needs, how they would make sure that every young person would have an opportunity to serve, how they would bring those young people together through professional development activities. So there's this, cross-cultural and there's interaction between different programs. And then also how states would incentivize. We know this isn't just, a federal program, as we've discussed before. So what local incentives would they be? It could look like housing, which we see in Flint, Michigan. It could look like, college access. So how would states also provide individual incentives? And then these flexibility that is provided through these McCain fellowships that would be issued through the Interagency Council, where a young person could get this fellowship and then also create their own service opportunity in a local nonprofit. And so that is what we envision. And what one of the great things has been is that when we have been meeting on the Hill, there's a great appetite for this. There's interest in especially the local focus. And we've drafted it in a way to support other legislation that is currently out there. So you might have heard of the action bill that has been introduced by some of our great champions, Senator Reid, Senator Larson in the House. And the action bill is big and comprehensive and provides a lot of education incentives. And so we've tried to be very deliberate in crafting a bill that complements some of the bills that are already out there. And so we're kind of in the testing phase, getting feedback, incorporating that feedback into the legislation. And we hope to move this forward in the upcoming year and get a true bipartisan bill. And before I, turn it over, why now? We know we're in a very tough environment, but what's been really encouraging to see is, despite the proposed cuts to CNCS, as it was mentioned earlier by Barbara Stewart, the appropriation has gone up the past 2 years. We have a true bipartisan bill with an education award. As you probably know, the education award is taxed. And our partners at Voices for National Service have done a great job in moving a bill forward that would remedy that. And it's a true bipartisan bill in both the Senate and in the House. We have the commission that's going to be coming out with recommendations. And we have communities that are coming to us every day wanting to become a service year impact community, raising their hands saying we see service as a strategy. So we very much believe now is the time. We've tried to be very deliberate in crafting a bill that would move us forward towards the scale and build upon the infrastructure that we already have, and just thrilled to be part of this discussion today.
Let me just briefly bridge from number 3 to number 4. First of all, Tay, thank you very much for a very clear and compelling summary of a piece of legislation that I think most people didn't know very much about until you laid it out. So thank you for that. I also want to thank you for giving me an idea for a new service corps. It would be made up of lawyers searching for meaning, and it would be massive.
And I think one of our talking points is that demand very much outweighs supply, and I can guarantee you that core would be very much the same.
I'm married to a recovered lawyer, so I can say that. Okay, now, Pete Waner, we heard a little bit earlier that from a public opinion standpoint, support for national community service might be a little stronger on the Democratic and independent side than it has been historically on the Republican side, though it's not non-existent there. So from your perspective, what does the case for national service look like?
Great. Thank you. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being here, Bell and the Brookings Institution for organizing this, hosting it. For the colleagues here, 2 of whom are longtime friends, great scholars, but they're better people and better friends than they are scholars. And in my book, friendship and character matters more even than scholarship, but they have both. And I do want to say, just echoing what Bill said, which is this report, first, it's a short report, so you should read it. It's interesting, and it is a model of honest inquiry, and that's not always the case with reports, but this is. And the question here is, should America embrace national service? Will it? I don't know. Should it? I do know, yes, it should. But often the resistance to national service is found most on the Republican side or the conservative side, as Bill was saying. As a lifelong conservative, and for most of my life, a Republican up until about 3 years ago or so. let me make the conservative case for national service. There are three areas that I want to briefly touch on. One is I think it's good for the unity of the country. Second is I think it's good for the people who engage in national service. And third, I think it's good for the people who are on the receiving end of national service, the receiving end of relationships, of care and of love. So let me take those in order. I think it's good for the unity of the country, and that's something that conservatives actually once cared a great deal about. In a nation of immigrants, which conservatives have traditionally celebrated, they often also spoke about the importance of assimilation. It respected, the belief was that we should respect diversity, but there was also a need for a sense of unity, that the idea of love of country involved a sense of citizenship. And I think that that's right, and I think that needs to be recovered. The motto, the American motto is E pluribus unum, and I think you could argue that there's too much focus on the pluribus and not enough on the unum these days. And it's not just a theoretical concern. I think today there's so many sources of social fragmentation and disunity. The social media, we see it, and that's, I think, an accelerant, a driving force. Economic inequality, polarization, the rise of identity politics on both the left and the right, a lack of trust in institutions and in one another. The term political tribalism, I really don't recall that being used much prior to a decade or so ago, but now it's really on the lips of almost everyone who speaks about politics. So the centrifugal forces are overwhelming the centripetal forces in American life. I think we're more flying apart than we're coming together. And I think national service will help the centripetal forces to gain strength. National service provides shared experiences in solving public challenges. It connects people from different classes and ethnicities and races and life experiences in ways that they often would otherwise not connect. And I'm guessing a lot of you know this from your own personal experience, your own lives, which is when people work together side by side for a common purpose, political differences de-intensify. And if there's one thing that we can use in America today, it's the de-intensification of political differences. The Panetta Institute for Public Policy did a study, and they said that reports that participants of all races and backgrounds describe how their service has taught them new perspectives and approaches and exposed them to groups of people with whom they would not have identified in the past. And if you ask me what one of my wish lists were for the country and for us as individuals, one of them would be help me to see the world through the eyes of others, to better see the world through the eyes of others, not necessarily to agree with them, necessarily to buy into everything they believe, but to understand their perspective more. And without going too much into philosophy, epistemological modesty has been central to conservatism as I've understood it. It's the notion that none of us by ourselves can have anything like a full understanding of the nature of truth and reality. We need other people to gain those things, and part of that is having experiences with people who then have standing in your life to be able to impart those different perspectives. In 1990, Bill Buckley, who was really a founder of modern conservatism, wrote a book actually called Gratitude, Reflections on What We Owe Our Country, and he called for a year of voluntary national service for young people as a way to strengthen their feelings and appreciation for the nation. And he said, materialistic democracy beckons every man to make himself a king. Republican citizenship incites every man to be a knight. And he said that service to one's country calls forth the better angels within our nature and can ever so slightly elevate us from the trough of self-concern and self-devotion. And he spoke about his own experiences in World War II, and he talked about this close affinity that developed between the Hawaiian beachcomber and the Laramie cowboy and the college campus student in Greenwich Village. So in a sense, we become links in a golden civic chain when we're part of national service. Secondly, I think it's good for people who engage in national service. It benefits the helper as well as the help. I think national service helps shape human souls. I think it can help touch the human heart, and I think it can advance human flourishing. The premise here is that there is, and I think this is a premise that's based on data, which is there is a loss of connection and a feeling of lost community in America today. You have the iPhone generation. A lot has been written about that. This report makes reference to the latest findings in neuroscience, which is that we're hardwired to be in community, to coalesce, to cooperate, to empathize with one another. So in a sense, I think national service aligns with human anthropology, with really the way that we are and how we thrive. It develops practical skills. It furnishes educational opportunities. If you go through the data, the people who are engaged in national service report higher life satisfaction, self-esteem, better academic achievement, lower rates of drug abuse, and school truancy. And it instills an ethic of responsibility and a sense of gratitude. I actually think that in national life and in individual lives, gratitude is one of the most underrated virtues. I think it's extremely important. And when you find people who have gratitude, it has radiating effects outward. Third, I think it's good for the people on the receiving end of national service. It helps repair shattered lives. It helps broken communities rebuild. It reaches out often to people who are in the shadows of society and creates human connections, which we all need. And it makes people feel like they're the object of love and sacrifice, and that actually matters as well. Another conservative reason I favor national service is it's doable, it works, it solves problems. John DiIulio mentioned earlier that review of the literature that was done, it was 15 years ago, in a book called Civic Service, of those 139 studies. And as he mentioned, the positive outcomes exceed the negative outcomes by roughly 7 to 1. That sounds pretty good to me, actually. Conservatism, in my understanding, is the negation of ideology. You wouldn't know that often today, but once upon a time, that's what it stood for, embodied. And it puts a premium on human experience and what works, on problem solving. And I think national service can help solve problems. Not all of them, it's not a magic bullet, but I think it can nudge things in the right direction. I just conclude by saying I think the public is tired in many ways of where we are. We're tired of the acrimony and the antipathy, the divisions and disconnection, the loneliness and isolation, the pulsating anger and the feelings of grievances toward the other, and the pernicious belief that we don't have opponents, but we have enemies. And I think national service can be a kind of civic balm for this moment. I'll just conclude. One of my favorite lines in poetry is from Wordsworth in the Prelude. It's a very long poem, but he has a great line in it where he says, "What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how." And I think that national service can teach people how to do certain things, how to create greater respect for one another, greater understanding, and that it can help heal the wounds of a wounded land and wounded lives. And I think that's an enterprise that conservatives should be able to get behind, and all Americans. Thanks.
Yeah. Pete, that sounded so much like a benediction that I'm almost unwilling to continue. But it is my duty to continue. So, let me just make a couple of remarks before we segue to the next phase of this panel. Remark number one is that for those who have ever doubted Brookings bipartisanship, I would like to point out that we have organized one of the largest reunions of Bush administration alumni that Washington has seen for quite some time. So but the second point is a little bit more serious, and it pivots off a piece of what Pete Waner just said that jumped out at me, and it isn't anything that probably jumped out at any of you, but it's what hit me. The phrase, "the nature of reality." Okay, and it struck me that what liberals and conservatives have in common is a belief in an ascertainable nature of reality, although we may have different views as to the best path to it. What right-wing populists and left-wing postmodernists have in common is the abolition of the idea of the nature of reality. And so that, in my judgment, is the real struggle in which we're engaged. And one of the great things about national service is that it is intense reality therapy, in addition to all of its other benefits. Now, on this side of my notes, I have a long list of rivetingly brilliant questions that I was going to put to the panel, but you've anticipated me. You know, I'm going to call an audible here. I'm not going to do that because we have a large and well-informed audience, you know, of people who have been connected with this movement in one way or another, or who have important questions to put to its advocates. And so I'm going to suppress myself, which, you know, after 25 years of Yom Kippur, 25, felt like 25 years, 25 hours of Yom Kippur, you know, just represents a continuation of self-sacrifice, because it, you know, you've been very patient. It's your turn. So let me just take hands as I see them. Please identify yourselves and then ask a question. Yes, sir. And there's a roving microphone that's coming around.
Thank you. Carl Gollivan, retired special agent, U.S. Customs, domain reference and ideal, liveson.net. Your reference to lawyers seeking meaning, I just have to share a perhaps enabling document for that organization would be Frederick Bastiat's The Law from 1850. If anyone hasn't read it, it gives new meaning to the purpose of lawyering. But national service, does it qualify as a national service to seek government transparency in all things? But yet, is that something that the federal entity will never legislate to support? And as a 9/11 responder, I'd just like to share with you the national service of thousands of architects and engineers as AE911truth.org. They have documented that the official story of the collapse of the 3 towers in New York is not true, and there's evidence of explosive demolition. So is seeking government transparency a form of national service?
Let me take 3 questions, and then I'll try to deal with, okay, I'm going to take one more there and then shift over here, and then I'll come back. Don't worry.
Thank you. Peter Shutley, retired from Brookings, but 29 years of federal service, State Department and the military. My question is about mandatory national service. During the Vietnam years, one of the things that aggravated dissension in this country, disunity, was the number of people who escaped the draft through all kinds of devious, nefarious ways. I conclude from that a mandatory system whereby everybody serves, if you're flat-footed or not, would overcome those differences and those antagonisms. So my question to the group is, wouldn't mandatory, despite its challenges, have that benefit?
And now over here, microphone, please. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cameron Maripes. I'm a research fellow at Civic Enterprises. And my question to the panel is, as a recent college graduate and a millennial, what are some tools that I can use to motivate and inspire my peers to get involved in national service?
Panel?
All right, let me start with that one. So we got a call many years ago from a college student at Yale, and he said, I'm going to start an Ask Not chapter at Yale and try to get colleges all across the country to create Ask Not chapters. One, to make, Barbara talked about the lack of awareness of all these programs and opportunities. One, to make young people aware that you don't just have to go into a job or onto grad school or some other option, but you could actually invest a year or more of your life in service to the nation. So my first reaction would be, in Florida, in your community, get them to start an Ask Not chapter and get other colleges to do the same. Second, the Service Year Alliance has created serviceyear.org, which is actually, you can go, Cam, and put your profile on serviceyear.org, and then find a whole host of opportunities, national service opportunities to connect to. And the beauty of that is it's driven, again, by choice and was sort of reflective of Shriver's vision of democratizing national service and getting all these institutions across the country, including colleges, to create service year programs. On mandatory national service, it's a brilliant point. First of all, thank you for your service to the nation and the State Department. We're organizing a U.S. delegation to Israel, because the first question we usually get in discussions like this is, Israel has done this successfully at many levels. It's had a profound impact on their society, their economy, entrepreneurship. So we're actually going over to learn from Israel components that are relevant to our system here, knowing we have a little bit of a libertarian instinct and there's a lot of opposition to mandatory national service. But I will say, by having a requirement for 18-year-olds to go into the IDF, and then there are exceptions for orthodoxy or religious views or certain exceptions, disability, it has created this environment where more than 35% of those who aren't conscripted voluntarily sign up for civilian national service. And just by contrast, in the United States, it's less than 1% who are serving from these cohorts. So we think it does have a profound effect. We're going to go study the program and learn what we can. And I'll let somebody else talk about government transparency.
Thank you. One thing I want to say, I think there is a tremendous need for greater awareness of these programs and so forth, on the one hand. On the other hand, in every year, really since the creation of AmeriCorps, there have been more people that wanted to do it than there were funds for it. And in some years, it's been a dramatic gap between the number of people who, were ready to go through the process, I want to do this, and the funding's not there. At colleges and universities that have the equivalent of, 4+1 programs, or at least some degree of fully paid, right? So that's a very practical reality for especially for, the vast majority of students who don't have means to just take off a year or be supported by, family or by a trust fund or something. If you offered that, the little program I referenced, at one point we did summers and spring breaks, but we also had a full year of service that we would do, it was in post-Katrina New Orleans, and over the 10 years of our commitment, we must have had 50 students do those one-year commitments. But we had about 300 students that wanted to do it, and if we could have funded 300, we'd have had 300, and then we'd be running New Orleans from Philadelphia. So I think there is a need to figure out how to inspire and engage and spread information on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's a lot of latent, unmet demand that's just about having the human and financial infrastructures, organizational infrastructures to make happen. With regard to the mandatory national service, I just would underline what Bridge said. The constitutional questions have been answered. There is a zone of constitutionality. But the political question is the thing. I actually think mandatory service would be great, but the political support for it isn't there.
I'm happy on the transparency question. Yeah, I think there's an obligation for government for transparency, but I'd say that transparency is a means, and the end is truth and reality. And I would say that government has an obligation for transparency, but there's a civic obligation also to accept reality as well. And to make sure that transparency isn't used to twist reality into things that aren't true.
One other thing, Cam, on colleges, a lot of schools are now looking at making, if you do a service year, it's actually really relevant to getting into the college. Or like William and Mary has created these service year fellowships because Robert Gates is the chancellor and believes in this idea and is the co-chair of our campaign, and is advancing actual service year opportunities through the college system. So imagine if you even had a third of the colleges in the United States creating service year fellowships, real opportunities connected to courses of study. I think it would have mutually reinforcing benefits, and that's something you could advocate too.
Before we get to the next round of questions, I just want to address a question to Tay based on what John DiIulio just said. He pointed out absolutely correctly that the problem for service at this point is not on the demand side, it's on the supply side. And With regard to government's role in national service, I can report to you that from the very beginning of AmeriCorps, there's been a gap between the authorization process and the appropriations process. And so my question, and this report makes clear, that the Edward M. Kennedy Service Act has authorized 4 times as many positions as are actually funded. So as you redesign the architecture of national community service in the admirable way that you've proposed, do you have a strategy for closing that gap between authorization and appropriation?
Yeah. Hello? Okay, there we go. I continue to struggle with the mic. So we do, and I don't know if it's the perfect answer, but one of the first things, or ways that we look at this is because there's that gap, as Bridge was talking about, we do have serviceyear.org, and programs can certify positions. We very much mirror the certification process that CNCS goes through to create their own service years. And so we do want a way where we can move forward and experience growth, even if we're not seeing it on the federal level. I think one of the ways that we drafted our legislation, because it is going to be, at the end of the day, very much tied to a reauthorization of AmeriCorps, but that focus on the local communities, creating these evidence points at scale and that demand, and raising their hands, and then also providing incentives on the community level to incentivize services. We see that as one of the first steps to get towards that growth. But by no means do we have the complete answer, but we really think it's really kind of starting at that local level, and then also growth through our service year exchange.
Thank you. We have time for one more round of 3, so I'm going to take this gentleman, I promised him, and then the woman in the aisle, and then there are 2 hands in the back, and I'm only going to be able to take one of them. I will take the gentleman on the aisle as well. So over here first.
Thank you, Bill, and hope your fast was easy.
It was not.
Max Finberg, a proud successor to Sergeant Shriver as Director of AmeriCorps Vista, proud Truman Scholar as well, and the last time I was here at Brookings was on a panel on the faith-based initiative that both of you had a hand in. Speaking of that, especially for this panel, what's the role of faith in national service, especially looking forward to the future?
Yes, and now 2 questions on the aisle. You have the microphone, good.
Hi, Jenny Lawson, Chief Civic Innovation Officer at Points of Light. In my role there, I work a lot with the business community, so my question is a corollary, which is, what's the role of business? I know there's been some demonstration of national service projects, but how does business play into solutions for national service?
And then the gentleman on the aisle. There you go. Thank you.
So that was my question, so I will yield to the other hand.
Actually, mine's a perfect corollary. I'm Sean Riley with the Philanthropy Roundtable. What's the role of philanthropy?
I could not have planned these questions better, but I assure you I did not. Okay, panel, we have 3 minutes and 7, 6, 5 seconds to answer these 3 questions.
All right. Bridge asked me to do faith, so I'll do faith. I think the most important observation to make in the time we have is to note that if you look at all the partnerships, the word partnerships and relationships, those words have come up a lot, in the actual administration, the translating of the ideals and ideas of national service into action, the faith-based communities are all over it. They have been, they continue to be. It's inconceivable without them. The problem there, too, is a problem of resourcing and capacity, a problem of doing the knitting, of doing the dot connecting. That has long been the problem, and without getting very sidetracked, I think it was a problem on which we were making some non-trivial progress in the not too distant past, but I think a lot of those programs and policies have fallen away. When you start a couple of years ago with a proposal to eliminate the Corporation for National Community Service, that means eliminating all that it does and all of its partnerships. That's a bad idea. And so that also creates a chilling effect for the partners out there. You talk to people in the faith communities across the board, whether big parachurches or small community-based congregations or networks, and they worry about getting involved to the extent that, is this going to be sustainable? Because they know there's a tough politics of this. But the faith communities remain, I would say, if not the primary partners, a substantial partner in the cause of national service programs.
I'd say quickly on business and philanthropy, the encouraging note is that they invest $1.2 billion for the $1 billion invested by the federal government today, and that's really encouraging. But I think businesses can look at what are the institutional changes we can make to foster and ignite a culture of service, i.e. it's highly relevant to get a job at this company or that company if you've done a year or more of national service, just like Terry McAuliffe did. In state government, if you served in the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, Vista, you actually had preference to get a public service job in state government. We could get every governor in the United States to do that. We could get every business. But I'd go further. Now that the Business Roundtable has redefined the purpose of a corporation and more than 200 CEOs have signed on to it, which was actually quite a sea change, including giving back to communities, why not challenge America's businesses to take on large public challenges like AT&T over a dozen years said we're going to move the high school graduation rate from 66% to 90%, and they've stuck with it, invested $500 million in it, and national service through City Year, Alan Casey's co-founded organization, communities and schools, and these organizations are actually at the center of providing the student supports to keep those kids on track. So I think issue-based investment, and then finally impact communities. Why can't they help organize with us in Flint and in San Jose and all these communities we're working in, universal national service efforts where we knit military, public, and civilian national service together. And points of light, your legacy is so extraordinary with President George H.W. Bush, and thanks for what you do.
Okay, Pete, any concluding comments? Nope. Well, very good. Let me just bridge to the next panel by saying that Alan Casey, whose name was just invoked, will be leading it. I can report to you that I learned everything I brought with me into the White House about national service from Alan Casey because of a site visit that I did to the City Year program back in 1992. And so never doubt the possibility of a small band of determined people making a very, very big impact. And with that, on to the final panel.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.